Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hey Culture. Back on today's episode, and somebody who's becoming a regular is Dr. Richard G. Howe. Dr. Richard, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor. So excited to be here.
The previous episode, I did an interview with your wife, and I quizzed her about whether the G really stands for good looking, and she said that's what you told her all these years, so she believes it to be.
I figure if you hear a lie long enough, you'll start to believe it's actually true.
Oh, that's true. Scripture kind of affirms that that faith comes by hearing. But so if you guys want to know more about Dr. Howe, I would refer you back to the episode we did on postmodernism, where I did an in-depth bio. But just quickly, Dr. Howe is the vice principal. Am I correct? At
No,
SES?
provost. The word is provost, whatever that means.
Provost.
Yeah.
Okay. So provost of Southern Evangelical Seminary, and he himself might not say it, but me and some of my colleagues would say an expert on Thomistic philosophy, and also just an expert on philosophy in general, which makes you the perfect person to speak to on today's episode. But before we get there, maybe just tell us a bit about Southern Evangelical Seminary and why somebody would want to study with you guys.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I discovered in traveling to different countries is that the term evangelical is not used uniformly. So I want to just make sure people understand what that qualification means in an American English usage. Evangelical basically is a very conservative Protestantism. Is what that means. And very often, probably more often than not, a person who identifies as an evangelical is going to have a very high regard for Scripture, particularly inerrancy and inspiration and inerrancy of the Scriptures. So that's why the seminary took that as part of its name. And of course, the southern part, just the fact that we're in the southeastern quadrant, if you will, of the continental United States. So we were co-founded by Norman Geisler, who's, in my opinion, is probably the premier apologist of the 20th and into the 21st century. He went to be with the Lord in 2019. And Geisler just realized, and he had taught at several different seminaries and Bible colleges over his career, but he noticed there wasn't really a seminary that was saturated with apologetics. And other issues too, but particularly that one. So he decided to found a seminary. This was in the early 90s. And his distinctive philosophical approach, and you mentioned the fact that I know some philosophy, that's my formal training, but I'm not unbiased in the sense that I'm not without conviction as to what I think is actually true in the similar way in which we are with our theology. Someone say, hey, Reno's here to talk about the Bible, but when you talk about the Bible, you don't talk about it in some detached, indifferent kind of way, as if you don't have an opinion about what it means, right? And it's the same way in apologetics and philosophy. So Geisler infused the curriculum of Southern Evangelical Seminary with a heavy dose of philosophy and apologetics that undergird the way we do our theology. And that tradition is often referred to, or sometimes at least referred to, as classical realism or metaphysical realism, or more narrowly, Thomism, which is the philosophy of Aquinas. So that invariably will be part of the way I'm sort of jaundiced in some people's opinion, but clear-eyed in maybe other people's opinion in an evaluation of someone like a Kant, for example. So that's what we do. So one of the things also, you can go to ses.edu to find more about the seminary. And what we've put in place is, I forget the handy little phrase that they use, but it's sort of equal sacrifice. That is that the tuition for classes, if someone's interested in working on a degree, anything from a bachelor's in religion to a master's in religion or apologetics or philosophy to a doctor of ministry to a PhD in philosophy of religion, the tuition is adjusted according to the exchange rate, if you will, or I guess exchange rate's the closest thing to that particular country. That way it makes it more affordable, I think, in terms of countries around the world that have a pretty exorbitant delta in their exchange rate. So think about that. And if you're not necessarily interested in a degree, there's always the option to take courses called audit. You just audit the class and you get access to the materials and the lectures and such, but you're not really working for credit. And so it's a lot less expensive. and it's also a lot less stress. You don't have to worry about tests or papers or things like that. So you've got a choice there. So ses.edu, reach out to there and find out what you want. And you can always get me at rhowe@ses.edu. That's my work address, and happy to do that. info@richardghowe.com is the address that comes to Rebekah and me if you're interested in some more specific things about my particular take on things and my particular ministry. So,
yeah, so I'm definitely one of those people who sing hallelujah for the Equal Sacrifice Scholarship, because that allows me as a South African to study with you guys. But what I'll suggest to the audience, if any of you are South African listening to this and you're interested in a degree in theology, is, some of you might know, I work for Apologetics SA, even though this podcast is done under a non-profit company called Sala, but in the daytime I work for Apologetics SA's Bible College. Come study with us, do a bachelor's degree, and then skip your honors, go over to a master's degree with SES. You won't regret it. And then we need more people equipped in our nation in this regard. So go
absolutely.
over. I'll link it in the description. Go over to ses.edu.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah, Bible college there is it can't be beat. So that's I'm glad you pointed that out clearly. That would be a perfect prep for further study at SES. So got a great team there, and a number of them are part of the SES family. I'm so excited to say. So we have a great relationship.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you guys. Well, with the formalities out of the way, I think let's jump into the meat. To start us off, I know there's a little phrase you have with regards to Immanuel Kant. So maybe tell us that quote, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, I studied under Norman Geisler back in the early 80s at a seminary called Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, where he's taught for about a decade, theology and philosophy. Excuse me. And I remember one day in an apologetics course that he walked into class, and these are these elevated classrooms. I know you guys know what these are like in your universities. And, 60 or more men and women in there ready for the day's lecture. And he came in that day and he said, Immanuel Kant has influenced your life more than Jesus Christ. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't even know if I know who Immanuel Kant even is. This is a lecture I got to hear. I'm very curious, because I who wouldn't as a Christian say that Jesus has influenced their life more than anything? And he's being sort of facetious, deliberately provocative to hook us in to consider carefully the philosophy of Kant and the degree to which it may very well have influenced our life, almost always in a deleterious way. That is, an influence that gets in the way of sound thinking along the Christian worldview, if you will. So he got me hooked for sure. And I took it from there. And over the years, the name of Immanuel Kant comes up now and again in any number of ways, not only in terms of metaphysics, but philosophy of religion, and also ethics and epistemology. So, you pretty much can't talk philosophy without saying something that Kant's got something to say about that he does, that he fails to mention. You're not going to find something that he fails to mention, it seems like.
Yeah, it reminds me, I spoke to Dr. Richard Weikart, who the historian, and he said anything after Immanuel Kant is an answer to Immanuel Kant in the realm of philosophy. But before we get into unpacking that statement that you made, for especially those watching at home who have their hair standing array, because how can we say that Immanuel Kant had a bigger influence than Jesus Christ? Let's get into who is Immanuel Kant.
So he was a largely 17th century Christian German philosopher, born in the early 1700s, died 1804. The significance of his dates, as we will get into, was the influences on him, most especially David Hume, and why that matters. So that's the significance of when he lived. And he fell initially into the rationalist, what is known as the rationalist tradition. And I don't know how much detail your viewers are interested in under the constraints of time. I don't have anywhere to be until Saturday morning. You know, right now it's Thursday afternoon in the U.S. and Thursday, I guess, evening in South Africa. But basically, there's been this flow of thought that had kind of been divided, cataloged, if you will, by historians of philosophy, of this rationalist tradition, whatever that is, and the empiricist tradition, whatever that is. And we can say a little bit about those. But pending that unpacking, by and large, he fell into this rationalist tradition. But because of some stuff he was reading in Hume, it really gave him pause about the plausibility of everything he had been thinking in philosophy. So he had to go back and see if he could do an end run around the skepticism that David Hume had confronted him with. And so, you know, in a way, not to oversimplify, he tries to fix a problem that certainly was a problem. But in many people's opinion, critics of Kant, it was one of those situations where you've heard the expression, the cure is worse than the disease, right? So, you know, if someone's got a head cold, you go, hey, this arsenic here will cure your head cold. Yeah, it'll cure my head cold because it'll kill me and I won't have a head cold because I won't have a head anymore. You know? It's like, well, that's not the kind of cure I want. Granted, it'll take care of the head cold because I won't be here, but that's not what you want. So some would say that what Kant offers as a response to what he thinks are the value and then failing of each of these traditions of the rationalist empiricist tradition, he comes up with a model that some would suggest did more damage than either of those traditions' failings would have even done anyway. So that's the situation that he finds himself in.
Would you quickly define for us, if you can, in a sentence or two, what the rationalist tradition was and what the empiricist tradition was? And then also, what is the problem you try to fix?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing as far as cataloging or the terminology that I'm a stickler for is let's pick the empiricism first. So typically today in analytic philosophy, which is the dominant philosophy in the English-speaking philosophical world, the term empiricism would be some form of the idea that all knowledge begins with or arises from our experience, our physical experience, or what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. That's where it either begins with or is constrained by. And so an empiricist today would be someone, you know, people would probably think of someone like a Richard Dawkins as, you know, if science can't prove it, then it's nothing to be known, right? So this strict kind of physicalism is what comes to mind with a lot of people when they hear the word empiricism. So just for my conscience sake, just for the sake of clarity, there is a form of this empiricism that finds its roots back in Aristotle, that Ed Miller, the philosopher Ed Miller, in his book Questions That Matter, designates as classical empiricism. So when the time comes, if we need to do it, I might cull from a classical empiricist view. But let's table that for the time being and understand how the term had begun to be used in the modern era since, say, Descartes, so 1700s on, or 1600s on, really, how these terms are used. So empiricism is knowledge is by the senses, what you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. The rationalist tradition is going to say that knowledge primarily, if not exclusively, is by the mind, by the reason. So it thinks largely in terms of what you can intuit. Like, for example, you can know, according to this tradition, certain truths like all triangles have three sides, okay? Or if you've got a thing and you break it in half, then each half is smaller than the original thing, right? Or truths of mathematics and all these kinds. So the rationalist tradition tried to say that that's where human knowing must be grounded in. We work things back to these indubitable, necessarily true philosophical rationalist truths, right? Now, here's the thing that confronted Kant. He started realizing that the value of the rationalist tradition in this modern sense in which we're talking, The value of it, it seemed to him, was the fact that its truths were certain because they were necessary, right? You know that all triangles have three sides. It's not like, well, I've never been to China. Maybe they've got a triangle over there that's 16 sides. You go, no, I don't have to look at every triangle to know they're all three-sided. I don't have to introduce myself to every bachelor in the world to know that he's unmarried, right? And so these truths carry this necessary and absolute certainty with them. But according to Kant, and I think a lot of people would probably agree with him, these truths don't seemingly necessarily tell you anything about the world. So sure, I know every bachelor is unmarried, but that doesn't tell you whether there actually are any bachelors. It could be that every man in the world is married, that's of marrying age, and so that there aren't any bachelors. It would still be true, all bachelors are unmarried, even if there were no bachelors, right? Just like we could say all unicorns have a single horn, but there aren't any unicorns. So Kant realized, wow, I appreciate the fact that these truths are certain, absolutely certain. I can't be wrong about them, but it's disappointing that they don't necessarily tell me anything about the real world. And then it's the reverse with the empiricist tradition in his mind, because the empiricists go, well, at least we're telling you stuff about the world. It is cloudy right now in the state of Georgia in the United States. Okay, that tells you something about the world. Problem is, though, in Kant's estimation, it's not absolutely certain, right? It could be cloudy right now and not cloudy tomorrow, or it could not be cloudy and I was mistaken when I said it was cloudy, right? Which I couldn't do about a bachelor being unmarried, couldn't be mistaken about that. So the value of the empiricist tradition in his estimation was it's informative. It tells you stuff about the world. The downside, however, is it's not absolutely certain. I've somehow got to go and look and see. Maybe it's not cloudy in some place in South Africa, but it is cloudy someplace in the U.S. And just, countless propositions you can make about the world around us that could be true or not be true. The proposition's not going to tell you one way or the other. Mm. Whereas in the rationalist tradition, the proposition itself already contains its necessity. All bachelors are unmarried. All triangles have, three sides. And you could just go on mathematical truths and stuff. So the truth of it is right in the proposition. I don't have to look out in the world. But the empiricists, the truth of it, if you just read the proposition, it is cloudy in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. If somebody just read that, they don't know whether that's true or not just by looking at it. They'd have to find somebody there or go there themselves and look and see. So Kant wanted to then see if he could figure out a way to marry the value of each of those, the certainty of these necessary rationalist truths, and the information-laden value of the empiricist truth. He could combine those into a single kind of knowledge that would give him the cue to really being able to do metaphysics and even physics. Now, let me just tag on to that a little bit more to the story, if I may. Mm. What had happened, particularly in the empiricist tradition, you're basically talking about people like John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. They're called the British empiricists. So fortunately for cataloging purposes, the three prominent empiricists were all from the Great Britain. So Locke was English, Hume was Scottish, and Berkeley was Irish, right? And interestingly, the rationalist tradition, conveniently for us as we catalog them, they're all from the European continent. So you've got Descartes, you've got Spinoza, and you've got Leibniz. Leibniz German, Spinoza was basically, it depends on what period of his life you want to catalog him, whether he ended up in the Netherlands or from Spain. But then Descartes was French. Okay, so these traditions, probably the one that had the biggest riveting influence on Kant was David Hume. In fact, in my classes, I in some respects might even say, it's a toss-up between how much apologists have been influenced by David Hume, as he's sort of the consummate skeptic, and influenced in the sense in this way, just to kind of tease your viewers as to why it matters. Several of the most important apologetic issues that we deal with today, the way we deal with them are the way the skeptic David Hume challenged Christians with them. Problem of evil, the problem of miracles, and the design argument for the existence of God. All three of those were the subject of his scathing critique, primarily in his dialogues concerning natural religion that he wrote. So if your viewers say, yeah, I deal with the problem of evil, if God's all powerful, then he could prevent evil, and if he's all good, he would prevent it. That kind of formulation, was revived in the writings of Hume from an ancient Greek formulation. So he sort of re-injected that problem of evil, if you will, back into the conversation. So that's what's going on. So the skepticism of Hume with respect to empirical knowledge really gave Kant pause about the viability of doing metaphysics. We care about metaphysics. I mean, he's a Christian. He believes in God. He believes in objective morality. He sees that these things have metaphysical elements to defending them. So he doesn't want to throw that out. Hume said all the books on metaphysics should just be burned because they're just useless trash. They don't tell you anything meaningful. Well, Kant doesn't want to do that. But he's got to somehow see how he can fend off this skepticism. So you know how in the history of science, we have the phrase, the Copernican revolution, right? With the change from Copernicus or from Ptolemy, that this Earth is the center of the solar system and everything revolves around it, to the sun is the center of the solar system and everything revolves around it. That was a major shift, right, in our paradigm in science. It took several centuries to sort of swallow. Kant is often labeled as a Copernican revolution in philosophy, because then he tries to come along to see if he can do, as I said before, the best of the rationalist tradition, leaving out its detriments, and the best of the empiricist tradition and leaving out its detriments to come up with a new model. And it's that new model we want to say a little bit about as we go along.
Yeah, thank you for that. Would it be too simplistic to say that the rationalist tradition, that the truths that they hold to was true by definition?
Absolutely. No, that's a great way to say it. It's true by definition. Bachelors are unmarried because the term unmarried is already contained, the predicate, in the sentence, all bachelors are unmarried. Unmarried is the predicate grammatically. The predicate's already contained in the subject. So it's true by definition. Triangles have three sides. Three sides is already contained in the predicate. And just as an aside, don't want to go down this road, but just to tease, I'm always kind of hinting at some future invitation to come back. So we brought this up last time and we didn't get a chance to talk about it. So I'll throw one out here. One of the things that this cataloging of the predicate is contained in the subject, if it is, then that's one of those true by definitions. If it's not, then that's one of those that you have to look into the world, see whether it's true. The thing that they're overlooking that Aristotle would have, if they had read Aristotle, they would have seen, is there are at least 5 different ways that a predicate can be in the subject. And when they just say it either is or isn't in the subject, they do violence to the actual way things in the world actually are. And there are 5 different ways. And the value of that is practically, I mean, suppose someone said, you know what, I saw our pastor out the other day at a restaurant with a woman who is not his wife. And you go, oh man, that's scandalous. I mean, we've already had too many of these moral falls and I can't believe that. Problem is, not his wife. There's more than one way to not be his wife, right? She could be his daughter. That would not be his wife. But she could be his sister. That would not be his wife. She could be his mother. That would not be his wife. None of which are scandalous at all. But if all you could say was he was with a woman who was not his wife, if that's the only way you said it, you sort of shoehorn the actual way reality is sort of more varied, and your grammar has just done violence to it, crammed it all into the predicate, not his wife. And now you could just get all kinds of scandalous thoughts from that point forward. And so I'm suggesting that, well, there are at least 5 different ways the predicate can be in the subject. That might matter for important things in philosophy of religion or metaphysics or epistemology. Indeed, it is, I think, important. So we'll come back to that maybe in a future podcast. If I haven't overstayed my welcome, we can talk about those kind of things later.
I'm glad to hear you want to come back. No, I like that. I'll make a mental note of a future episode titled Aristotle's 5 Ways. Then let's get into then what is the answer that Kant, or the cure Kant came up with.
Okay, so here's some terminology that is essential to hang on to, just for the sake again of the cataloging. When we say a proposition is true by definition, that's what Kant labeled as analytic. Now, we use that word in a lot of different ways, but in this context, an analytic proposition is a proposition that's true by definition, right? The predicate's contained in the subject. Unmarried is contained in bachelor. Three-sided is contained in triangle, right? He calls that analytic. The propositions where the predicate is not necessarily contained in the subject, like it is raining in Atlanta, is called a synthetic. And we use that word a lot of different ways in English. But in this context, analytic, true by definition. Synthetic, not necessarily true by definition. Analytic, you know the truth or falsity by looking at the proposition alone. Synthetic, you can only know the truth or falsity by looking outside the proposition to the world. Analytic, synthetic. Two other words that sort of parallel those two that Kant coined, and it's the standard nomenclature that philosophers talk in the standard glossary even today. And that is the terms a priori and a posteriori. I'm sure your viewers are quite familiar with these terms already, but just in case there's someone out there that might not be. A priori looks like the indefinite article priori, but it's actually just a single phrase, a priori. And you see the word prior nested. A priori knowledge is knowledge that you have before or apart from your sensory experience. Like I can know bachelor's unmarried without investigating the world just by virtue. So these analytic statements are known a priori. I don't have to investigate the world. I know them prior to or apart from empirical experience. A posteriori, and you see the word post, which means after, nested in the word. A posteriori is just the reverse. It's that it's knowledge gained on the basis of or entirely from or starting with empirical experience, the physical senses, if you will. So analytic, true by definition. Synthetic, not necessarily true by definition. A priori, known before or apart from experience. A posteriori, known on the basis of experience. So obviously there's a pattern. All analytic statements can be known a priori, according to Kant. All synthetic statements are known a posteriori. What he was wanting to do, and this was his big discovery, he said, is there a such thing as a synthetic a priori? Now think about this. This just is a label for what we've already discovered. Namely, he wanted the value of the content of a empirical statement, a synthetic statement, because it has content. It is raining in Atlanta, or it is cloudy in Atlanta, or whatever. He wanted that, but he wanted the certainty of the analytic, the a priori. So he wants a synthetic a priori. And that was his quest. How can I figure out whether there are things that I can know a priori, apart from any empirical experience, so to speak, yet it actually is content rich about the world? His quest for the synthetic a priori defines basically the quest. And so what he goes on to do, which we'll get to when you're ready, is say, well, okay, so give me an example of that, and how did you come up with it?
Oh, you can do that right now.
Okay, good. I'm going to take a sip of coffee because, I got to get ready for that. You saw my product placement there, didn't you, with my little SES mug?
Yeah, and the mug in the background as well.
That's right. You got which right there.
Yeah, that side, yeah.
No subtlety here, right? So what he did, here's the thing. The thing that I think was the single biggest worry that Kant had, there's lots of them, but one of them was the principle of causality. Now, we care about causality, don't we? We build our arguments for God's existence. The universe began to exist. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? That kind of Kalam cosmological argument, or you could do Aquinas's cosmological argument, or whatever. And we care about, well, what caused the COVID pandemic? Well, this virus caused that. Well, once we know the cause, we think we can do something about it. And all the way back to Aristotle, he would even define knowing things was largely knowing their causes, right? And so causality now has come under, really, it looks like it's on the execution table of David Hume. He's actually convinced many people that causality is not a truth that is demonstrable philosophically. Hume thought, and we don't need to know too much about Hume to understand what Kant's going to try to do. Hume thought all of our thinking causally. The cue ball, do you call them cue balls? And I don't remember, you have billiards there. I have to make sure my sports metaphors work,
Cool.
Let's do the foot on the rugby ball or whatever. The foot kicks the ball and it moves, right? And we say, well, the foot caused the ball to move. Hume's going to say, no, all we know is that we saw the moving of the foot, the contact of the foot and the ball, and the moving of the ball. And that's all. That's what Hume convinced everybody. We won't go into why he thought that was the case, but he just thought it was just psychological. Just like if somebody walked up and you went, knock, knock, and everybody would go, who's there? And do that joke, right? Well, what's the causal connection between knock, knock and who's there? And I think most people go, well, there isn't a real causal connection beyond just the psychology. Once you heard enough knock, knock jokes as a child, then the next time somebody said knock, knock, you just cannot help but expect someone to say, who's there? Or we have a song, and I think you have it as well in childhood, Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And you say, what's the causal relationship? There isn't one. Well, how come I never fail to think E-I-E-I-O every time somebody says, Old MacDonald? And Hume's just going to say, it's just habit. It's just psychology. There's no way that you can penetrate the nature of reality enough to say there is a such thing as cause. So now, if cause is under duress and under threat by Hume, at least Kant was convinced of that, then that not only brings your metaphysics into question, like arguments for God's existence, which were the philosophical tradition was replete with these. With the exception of maybe Hume, you didn't find any philosopher who wasn't saying something about God's existence. I mean, Hume said things about God's existence, but it was more towards the skeptical direction. So our metaphysics is under threat, but even more so, perhaps this mattered more to Kant. I mean, I can't read his mind. Our physics, that is our natural science, was under threat. Now, remember, we're talking the 1700s. Hume died in 1776. Kant died in 1804. Since the 1600s, the natural sciences have exploded onto the scene. You've got all of these things going on in an unprecedented way. And from the 1600s on, you have this it's almost too fast to keep up with how the natural sciences have flourished. They languished since Aristotle, didn't they? In most people's minds, all the way up until this period. And it's an interesting story. Well, why all of a sudden did they just explode on the scene? We'll table that one for a future conversation. Be that as it may, Kant's motivated. We've got to save causality. So here's what he wants to do. Okay, I agree with Hume, he says. We can't philosophically demonstrate that causality is true of reality in itself, the things in themselves. The phrase in German that's also gotten codified in subsequent conversation is the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, right? We can't know causality is true of the thing in itself. But Kant says, but it doesn't follow that there isn't a certainty. How does he do it? This was his Copernican revolution. He says, there are, as you know reality through your senses, you see what's going on, and they come in. Let me interrupt myself. Prior to this, even prior to Hume, the typical view among the empiricists was, when I see a tree out there, then my intellect has an image in my mind of the tree, like watching a monitor screen, and the camera is creating an image and you're watching the screen, right? So in a lot of these people, all I really know is what's going on the screen. I can't really see what the camera's pointing at directly. I just see what what it is on my screen. So they thought that's what's going on in the mind. And Kant thought, well, maybe instead this is what's going on. That is, the data that comes into me from the world around me, the things in themselves, the Ding an sich, when that comes into me, the mind itself organizes all that data according to the categories of time and space. Let's pick those two primarily, of time and space. So he would say, time is not something true of things in and of themselves. Time is the way in which my intellect always, never fails to organize the data according to the category of temporal succession and also spatial arrangement. All right. So he would say time is not true of things in themselves. Space is not true of things in themselves. They're only the way they appear to me. And so you had the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, and then the thing to me, or the terms that became attached to these that he used, the noumenal realm, that's the thing in itself, which is just categoryless, if you will. It doesn't have time and space and all these. As it comes in, you can imagine like a filter in the mind, and it just arranges the data according to the list. Again, just confine ourselves to time and space, and it arranges it by time and space. And then that's how I know reality, and I can never fail to know it any other way. So you see how that gives him certainty. Hume would say, well, you don't know tomorrow that the foot won't move the ball when it kicks it. You just can't help but think that it will because of habit, but you don't know for certain. Kant would go, I do know for certain because I could never know reality except according to the categories of time and space. And as he goes on to argue, time and space are what give rise to our category cause. That cause just is this temporal arrangement of an event here, a thing there, an event here. The foot, the ball getting kicked, and the ball moving. That's what we call cause. I can never not experience it that way. So it's absolutely certain. I'll never, ever not be able to experience the physical world except according to the law of causality, for example. And so that gives me the certainty that I need, but it still has the content that I want because I'm actually talking about feet and balls and the motion of the ball in him. So he has them both. He's got his synthetic a priori. So he teases that out. What's interesting about Kant, and this might be surprisingly familiar to your viewers, like, well, I was already going down that road. I didn't realize that Kant had much to say about that. His argument for, well, why would you think that time and space weren't true of reality in and of itself? Two things he was worried about. Well, first of all, if I try to make it true of things in and of themselves, then I won't be able to fend off the skepticism of Hume for whatever reasons he thinks that. So he thinks that model, that move, saying, well, no, time and space are true of the world around me in and of themselves. He go, well, then Hume's just proven his skepticism, and now you're just going to have to give up your science, right? So he wants to say, well, it's not true then in and of themselves. Then why should I think then that it's true of me? You know, he's going to make that catalogization. Well, another thing that bothered him was if you do think it's true of the thing, let's say time, for example, if you do think it's true of the thing in and of itself, not only will the skepticism of Hume scandalize that, but Kant said, I can prove a contradiction. If you tell me that the universe is eternal, I can prove to you, Kant thought, that it could not possibly be eternal. And people would probably read Kant and go, he's making the Kalam cosmological argument. Indeed, he is. He's making the argument exactly like the earlier philosophers were making for the beginning of the universe, and therefore it needed God as its cause. But Kant said, oh, that's not the whole story, though. If you think the universe began a finite time ago, I can prove that that's false. So I can prove that it's false, it's always existed, and I can prove it's false, it hasn't always existed. Well, according to the canons of logic, if you've got a contradictory conclusion, then at least one of your assumptions is false. Well, what's the false assumption? that time is true of the thing in itself. That's the false assumption. Instead, time is merely a construct that the human intellect imposes on the sort of amorphous data of the noumenal realm. And so that I can never fail to know reality temporally, but it's not true of the thing in itself. I avoid what are called the antinomies, Kant's antinomies. And he does it with space and stuff. You can read it in his Critique of Pure Reason and such. So now, if you're ready, we could go, okay, so what's the fallout to that? Because that's kind of what the topic was for today, in a sense. We started with Geisler's Kant's influenced your life more than Jesus Christ. What is the fallout to that? And over the years, I've thought about, unpacking some of the stuff that Geisler told us about the nature of reality and how we understand things. And at the risk of oversimplifying, and I had a list here in front of me. I want to make sure I got them in the right order here. But think about it. If you were convinced that you could not know this noumenal realm in and of itself, and by the way, just so you'll know, he goes on to talk about ethics, objective morality, his categorical imperative as it's known, and God. And he's already said we can't have the traditional arguments for gods. They're not going to work because the cosmological argument, the teleology, these are all trafficking in categories that Kant says are not true of the thing in and of itself. They're only true of our cataloging of it in our intellect. So we can't have these traditional arguments. Yet he did believe in the existence of God as a Christian. So he does this sort of in-run argument for that, but it won't be anything that people would recognize as a real solid argument for God's existence, objectively speaking. So we'll table that for the time being and such. So think about it. If Kant convinces somebody you really can't know reality in and of itself, which that's where God is, for example, all these kinds of things that are transcendent. If that's true, then what's the difference between that and there just not being those things in and of themselves? Right? If you're telling me my knowledge of reality is not, I can't know anything about God rationally and empirically or whatever. If I can't know anything about something, what's the difference between something I can't know anything about and there just not being that thing? And so there's a tradition that grows out of Kant that basically says there's really not much difference. As far as Kant's concerned, we might as well just be atheists. Now, they've entertained his argument for God, but I think they probably, history shows it didn't strike people as very persuasive. Certainly wasn't going to be enough to dislodge an atheism. So this sort of atheism, and in its worst form, this scientism, if all I can know is the thing as it appears to me, that's the natural sciences. So we don't need philosophy. We don't need theology and all this nonsense. We just need the natural sciences. That's your Richard Dawkins. That's your Victor Stenger or your Sam Harris. Well, maybe Sam might be a little different, but your Lawrence Krauss. Yeah, exactly. These kind of guys, or even more sophisticated version earlier, A.J. Ayer and such. All right. Now, but there's another reaction. Suppose somebody said, okay, so I can't know the in and of itself by means of my senses. Okay, Kant, you got me convinced, but that doesn't mean I can't have some conduit that I know this transcendent realm by some other faculty. And this, I think, has fed into the rise of a spiritism, the New Age and these kind of things. Yeah, I'll grant you, we don't need arguments for God's existence or the spirit realm. I have a direct connection and I have this mystical experience. You see this picked up a lot in Wittgenstein, not in Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein's disciples, if you will. There's a whole tradition in Buddhist philosophy built on Wittgenstein's his first work, what is known as the Tractatus. Wittgenstein goes to change his views later on. But this whole idea in the Tractatus was right in line with this. We can't really talk about this stuff because, Kant's already shown us that we don't know reality in and of itself. He would have probably had different ways of wording it, but nevertheless, Wittgenstein's right on board in the Tractatus, right? But there are a lot of people go, okay, fine. I got another way to tap into it, and that's a mystical experience. And then you have a sort of maybe watered down version of each of those that go in two different directions. One that I think has impacted Christianity a lot since Kant is this, there's actually maybe two versions of even this. You have a fideism to say, okay, fine, logic and reason can't deliver the truths of religion, but I accept them entirely by faith. So I just know that this is true. I accept it by faith. It's a leap of faith into the dark, right? And that kind
So
of
it would
stuff.
be a blind faith.
The fideism, yeah, the fideism is sort of fueled by this tendency from Kant. But you also have maybe not a fideism, but what I disparagingly refer to as a fundamentalism. Now, that term has changed drastically over the 20th century in American English. In the early 20th century, a fundamentalist would have been like a conservative Protestant who believed in the fundamentals of the faith, the inerrancy of the Bible, the resurrection of Jesus, the Trinity, the deity of Christ, what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity. So if you were committed to the fundamentals, you could have fellowship with another believer, even if you disagreed over the end times or speaking in tongues or things that people can dispute, right? Christians can dispute. So that was an early use of the term fundamentalism. By Second World War, or sometime after the Second World War, for reasons we won't go into now, the term fundamentalism became attached to this sort of anti-intellectualism, right, in the Christian faith. And so this fundamentalism said, okay, well, I'm not a fideist, but I have this view of the Bible that requires me to just constrain all of the supposed truths of the sciences and shoehorn that into my fundamentalist religion. And so you find in American Christianity this idea like, well, I'm not totally against science, but I think, the scientists are all wrong about most of the stuff. Now, all of us probably say that about some things. Probably most of your viewers, we would be in solidarity and repudiating Darwinism, right? Mm-hmm. But other things about science, we wouldn't be so eager to just table and go, well, yeah. So it's a kind of blurry line between the fideists and the fundamentalists in this regard. But in an illicit way, they want to shoehorn the findings of science into their fundamentalist categories. The reverse, however, would be this form of liberalism, Christian liberalism. What do? They go, well, the scientists, they tell us, and by scientists, I mean that pretty broadly. They tell us, for example, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, because we know now from the study of history that it was a collage of different writers, the JEPD, or the documentary hypothesis, right? We know now that Genesis is not right about the origin of humans. We've actually evolved from common ancestors. So the liberal tends to overemphasize the supposed findings of science and squeeze and shoehorn everything about the Bible into this. Let's make Genesis compatible with Darwinism. Let's make Moses compatible with JEPD. Let's make Isaiah compatible with Deutero-Isaiah. Let's make the Synoptics compatible with the Q document, or whatever their theory is that may cast some aspersions on the integrity of the Synoptics or whatever. Just countless examples. So one side is going to shoehorn in an illicit way the findings of science to a very narrow theology. The other is going to shoehorn the findings of theology into the narrow constraints of science. And then the last of it, besides the sort of scientism, the spiritism, the fideism, and the fundamentalism and the liberalism, is basically postmodernism. And that's a whole nother topic, isn't it? But postmodern, for the most part, are going to be relativists about truth, right? And it can get pretty sophisticated. I mean, obviously, if somebody says there are no truths, as Frank Turek is famously quoted to say, is that true? And only he can do in that New Jersey accent, right? But not all. In fact, most of the postmodernists are not that easy to refute, that they're not that flagrantly self-refuting. It's self-refuting nonetheless, but it's nested down a number of folders before you find out, okay, there's the breakdown right there. So you get people like Michel Foucault, who would in effect argue that truth claims are basically power. They're political power struggles. That's what they are. And very often claims to truth are means by which one segment of society is trying to subjugate another segment of society and stuff. So it's truth is power, for example. and other forms of postmodernism give us this relativism, all stemming from the fact we can't have access objectively to the real world. So now that's a oversimplified summation of how I see these things. The answer to that will be what we can talk about on another occasion.
So,
where the cure for the disease had already been in place for more than a millennium, but for reasons that we'll go into, got lost, and then this disease emerges, and now that's why SES exists, to revitalize this classical tradition within conservative Protestantism, and say this is really the answer to the problem of evil, the Euthyphro dilemma, the existence of God, the attributes of God, the objectivity of truth. These things are already there and were celebrated by the church fathers, and were inculcated into Christian theology, but it eventually sort of fades away a little bit later on, again, to oversimplify things.
Let me see if I followed correctly. So he set out to gain some certainty, or he set out to gain certainty, but he left us with a lot of uncertainties.
Absolutely. He left us with a lot of uncertainty, because the only certainty we get is just how things appear to me. And people began to take that ball going. So if I don't know how things really are in and of themselves, I just know how they are to me. That's a postmodernism. If you carry that out, which is not what Kant intended, or that's a form of skepticism, almost a scientist. Well, that's not what he meant. I mean, he didn't want people to do that. He thought he was giving us everything we needed to do the natural sciences and do the level of metaphysics that we needed. But I think history has shown it created more problems than it solved. It was a lot easier to answer Hume different than Kant did, in my humble opinion, than create this monstrosity of an epistemology that history has proven, I think, to be bankrupt. In fact, philosophers often will define modern philosophy as pre or post-Kantian. And it's not just pre or post chronologically, like if it's after 1804, then it's post-Kantian. People can be post-Kantian, meaning they're doing the same mistake Kant made even before Kant made it, just maybe in a different way. Anytime there is a move to try to sever our knowing of reality from reality itself by means of the image in my mind, or the worldview that I have. Oh, a worldview is just the glasses through which you interpret everything. I go, well, if that's what it is, then I don't know how things really are. I just know what my worldview tells me. Startling, a lot of worldview conversation I hear in contemporary apologetics is just a sort of a really, really truncated version of Kant, where your worldview just becomes that filter in the intellect that Kant was doing. I go, that can't possibly be right. Your metaphysics and philosophy somewhere has to hook up with what's real. Otherwise, then you don't know anything, which couldn't be true for reasons we can get into in another occasion as well.
So it's been a few years since I read Geisler's Christian Ethics, but would you mind venturing a bit into how did this view of Kant funnel into his ethic?
So the options basically that were on the table largely were a form of kind of a consequentialism, sometimes called a utilitarianism, which that which made something right or good depended on the result or the consequences of the action. So this would be people like John Stuart Mill would be the most famous utilitarian. So the reason why it's right to do something is because it leads to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, what is sometimes called a social utilitarian, as opposed to the reason something is right or good is because it makes me feel good and I don't care about the rest of the world, which would be sort of this egoistic kind of utilitarianism. So this sort of utilitarian model of ethics was one option on the table for most people. And the other became labeled as deontological, which was the idea that things are good or not good in and of themselves in terms of the action, irrespective of the consequences. So Kant falls more into the latter, where something is good in terms of an action in and of itself as the action, and not in terms of the consequences of the action. So what he tries to go on to do is to formulate what became known as the categorical imperative. And that was that basically you would only do those things that you would be willing at the same time to opt for that to be universal. So in other words, you say, well, how do I know whether killing my neighbor when he curses at me is a good thing or not? And Kant would say, well, basically, would you want everybody to kill their neighbor? Would you want that to make it a universal maxim? And if you say yes, then it's good. And if you say, well, no, I don't want everybody to kill, okay, then that's not something that you would want to be your own action. You only want to do your own action in a way that would be universal for you. Now, there are counterexamples that people have come up with, but it's categorical imperative. So to put a little content into it, Kant, for reasons that one can explore, and that when you get deeper and deeper into his particular writings, he saw the quest that humans were invariably on, just as a matter of fact, was their own happiness. That's kind of like what Aristotle. People were always acting in a way that would lead to at least what they thought was their own happiness. Kant came to the conclusion that that's really what drives actions. Your goodwill is aiming towards this flourishing. He doesn't use that word that I know of. But he says that really can't be achieved in this life. Justice can't really be achieved in this life. Hitler didn't get his just deserts, unless you just think him dying was enough, but everybody dies, right? So, the greatest, Mother Teresa, people always pick her out as an exemplar moral person. She died and Hitler died. They all end up in the same place, seemingly, according to the thinking. So this life doesn't seem to be enough to achieve our happiness. There must be an afterlife. Now, Kant thought, well, I can't prove there's an afterlife because I've already basically rerouted and revamped what I think it is to prove anything. It's all by the categories of the mind. I don't know in reality in and of itself. But he said, as a transcendental kind of argument, if it's the case, there is a such thing of justice. There must be some ultimate justice. But since it obviously is in this life, there must be an afterlife, he thought. And in order to make sure that that justice is ultimately met out, this is just one thin line through his reasoning, there must be a God who makes all this to be the case. I can't prove that there's a God. I think none of the arguments work. I've already set up my epistemology in such a way that I couldn't possibly prove. I don't know things in and of themselves. He's not opting for a mysticism, right? He's not a fideist. He's none of that stuff. He's transcendentally arguing what must be true about reality in order to make sense of the fact that I seem to experience things like justice. And he teases that out and comes out with his, his notions of God, afterlife. And then if you back up from that, your concepts of objective morality in these deontological things. So it's a tremendously influential system. And even today, if you take an intro to ethics class, you're likely going to learn the utilitarian versus the deontological and stuff. What you probably won't learn in most Anglo-American philosophy departments in a typical university is the classical option. It just almost never, in my experience, gets a hearing. Except for maybe a little, sort of obligatory mention of Aristotle's virtue theory. But that won't make sense without the metaphysics, I think. So, you kind of just hanging out in thin air going, okay, that's really nice, Mr. Aristotle. Now let's just move on. And so the metaphysics doesn't really get explored as to why he had the theory that he did, that Aquinas picks up on, that the church picked up on, and saw that it resonated with a lot of Christian morality. Accidentally in Aristotle's case, since he didn't believe in a transcendent God. But that's what he's doing in a quick summary, oversimplified version of in his ethics.
So what was the practical outflow of Kant's ethical theory? Because I don't know if I remember correctly, but didn't it lead to a type of absolutism where people, for example, that lying is always wrong? So if the Nazis come and knock on your door and you have Jews hidden in your house, you can't lie to them because it would be wrong to save a life.
I think it could very well have done that. Yes. I'd have to reflect on whether or not I thought that kind of thinking in Christian thought was more attributable how people understood the Bible versus how they were influenced by Kant. But I think they might flow together, so that this you either have what is known as a conflicting absolutism or a non-conflicting absolutism, right? So most absolutists that I've known would just posit that all moral truths are absolute and none of them conflict with one another. But of course, the Jews hiding in your house seems to be a good example of, well, I seem to have two conflicting absolutes. The absolute don't lie, and the absolute that I have to look out for the well-being of someone whose status I'm in control of, right? I can control whether these Nazis find these people hiding or not. And I have to decide, am I going to lie or not? And of course, people say, well, you can maybe just don't say anything. I suspect if you were in the real world, if you just didn't say anything, they kill you and go look in your house and find them anyway. Right? But you go, well, at least I didn't lie. Okay, well, perhaps. Geisler comes up with this sort of graded kind of absolutism. At least he did in one stage of his ethics, but that's a topic again for another whole episode downstream.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, and we can get into the classical one as well.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a rich conversation. Not my having the conversation is not what makes it rich. I just mean the content.
Yeah. Now I'll be looking forward to that. So there's definitely two episodes that I'm jotting down that I'll contact you about.
Largely the natural law tradition is what is termed very often would be the classical version of morality. Yeah.
Interesting. We actually have a mutual friend, but I'm not, for reasons I'm not going to name the name now, but is venturing into a PhD, and he is deciding between doing it on natural law or doing it. I can't remember the different one. It's the friend that had somebody knit that thing for you. But yeah.
Okay. Well, I won't try to guess.
I'll tell you off air. But I can't remember that. There's two topics, but one of them is the natural law thing. So
yes.
Maybe we have a freeway conversation about that in the future. But
excellent. Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So we got to the hour mark. Any last remarks you wanted to make about Immanuel Kant?
I can't say there. Kant's hard to read in English translation. I don't read German, but he's important to read. And there are a lot of good secondary sources on Kant. A good history of philosophy. William Lawhead's Voyage of Discovery is a great sort of dispassionate, objective. Here's just what he says without a lot of critique. You might bring in a few critiques from different angles, that kind of stuff. So those kind of secondary sources, probably a little bit more of an in-depth or quite a bit more in-depth history of philosophy would be Copleston, Frederick Copleston's 9-volume set, right? So you can just get them. They're separately published. Get the volume. I think it's From Wolf, The Boundaries. Christian Wolff was a big influence on Kant as well. We didn't mention him, but he's another prior to Kant or contemporary that influenced him in some respect. So Frederick Copleston would be, as I teasingly sometimes say to students when they ask me questions, and then after I give them my answer, and then I say, that's more than you wanted to know. And then I jokingly I say, I'm tempted to start a podcast called More Than You Wanted to Know. You might be reading Copleston and think, okay, that's more than I wanted to know. There's a lot there. So Lawhead's a good inaugural step into as a secondary source. But then Copleston would be a great digestion of Kant. And also Gilson's book, Unity of Philosophical Experience, has a great chapter on Kant, specifically directed at these deleterious influences in the epistemology. Unity of Philosophical Experience by Etienne Gilson, the French historian of philosophy.
I'll see if I can find some of those things to link it.
Absolutely.
But hopefully people jotted it down and they can look it up. But
absolutely.
Last random question is there any reason that you think that philosophers or thinkers from Germany had such a big influence on the world? I'm thinking of Nietzsche, I'm thinking of Kant, and even Karl Marx himself. Why did the Germans themselves kind of shape the West so much.
Yeah, I think the one of the first things that comes to mind is the way that the Germans influenced us pushes things to the very front of what we care about. So when you think of something like the Frankfurt School and their deliberate agenda to inculcate into American universities these understandings of some of this Marxism and such, then that's a felt need, right? It's not only a real need, it's a felt need. That stuff just confronts you and you can't be indifferent about it. Whereas perhaps some of the influences that we might trace back to, let's say, Locke, are so subtle and foundational, like, you know, the role of government in freedom of religion, freedom of the press, these kind of things that we more or less just take for granted as part of Western civilization. We may not appreciate, well, that's English. That's Locke, for example. We don't really label it, at least in my experience, as much as we were more readily label the Marxism from its geographic location.
Okay.
So, you know, it would be interesting to sit down and just plot it and go, you know, there's probably an equal amount of influence from other places, but their geography doesn't get identified as readily as the Germans do. And part of that's because the agenda of some of these later Germans was deliberate, like Marx, like the Frankfurt School, for example. They were deliberately trying to proselytize to these philosophies, right? In a way, even perhaps some of the others weren't.
Even liberal theology finds its roots there.
Absolutely, no, it does.
It's
I mean, you know, the documentary hypothesis is just in the whole. Now, see, but the idea and the sort of effort to be critical in this bad sense of the term, it can, or at least it can be a bad sense of the term, to be critical in our treatment of the scriptures actually finds its origin in Spinoza. Okay, which is not German. He sort of gets the ball rolling. He's sort of the official first biblical critic there as a sort of secular Jew, if you will. So he, you know, so there you got something that the Germans really gave it a lot of oomph, but it didn't begin with them as much as it might have begun with a Spinoza there. But you're right; they gave it a lot of its content in biblical criticism and such. Absolutely.
So I just find it interesting, but that would be interesting to plot it out. Definitely.
Yeah. Formidable thinkers coming out of Germany. You can't be indifferent about these guys. They were too important to ignore.
It can make me help and think about that video you showed in the one lecture of the soccer teams, and you have the Greek philosophers against the German philosophers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, the Monty Python philosophy football or whatever. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, I think that's a good place to end us off. Thank you very much for this episode. I learned a lot, really a lot. I know in South Africa, and specifically speaking to John as well, we're really influenced by Kant and in a lot what you see out in public. But most people won't even know who Kant is, even though they are most probably influenced by him. So thank you very much for laying that out for us.
Thank you so much. Such an honor. Anytime I can do something for you and your viewers, please let me know.
Will do. Thank you. And at the audience, if you want to know more about Dr. Howe, I'll link his website as well as SES's website in the description below. And until next time, goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm René Fermor, and this is Hey Culture.